Tonight, Supreme vote. The Senate set to confirm Judge KETANJI Brown Jackson as the first black woman to sit on the Supreme Court. Plus, a new humanitarian crisis.
And people are coming, about 300 people every day.
Refugees fleeing the war in Ukraine, gathering at the U.S.-Mexico border. And a looming global catastrophe.
So don't be surprised if you don't see destabilization in several nations.
285 million people at risk of starvation in a perfect storm decimating the world's food supply. All this and more coming up on Faith Nation.
A monumental day in the 230-plus year history of America's highest court. Good evening and welcome to Faith Nation from Washington. I'm John Jessup.
And I'm Jenna Browder. The Senate voting this afternoon on a history-making confirmation. KETANJI Brown Jackson will be the first black woman to serve on the U.S. Supreme Court.
Today's vote brings an end to what was at times a contentious and mostly partisan nomination process. CBN Capitol Hill correspondent Matt Galka was tracking the vote. He joins us now from the Capitol. Matt?
Well, John and Jenna, the historical moment wasn't overshadowed by any surprises as the Senate voted to make Judge Jackson Justice Jackson. The final tally 53-47, with 3 Republican senators joining all Democrats to elevate Jackson to the high court.
On this vote, the yeas are 53, the nays are 47, and this nomination is confirmed.
There wasn't much drama around the actual vote, as many senators had already signaled their intentions to vote for KETANJI Brown Jackson's confirmation. Thursday's vote did provide both sides a final chance to get their points across in trying to sway their colleagues. Democrats emphasized the historic significance.
Today is also a joyous celebration in another way. In the 233-year history of the Supreme Court, never has a black woman held the title of justice. KETANJI Brown Jackson will be the first, and I believe the first of more to come.
The outcome for the president's pick was expected, with only a simple majority vote needed and Democrats controlling the Senate chamber. Then came further assurance when Republican Senator Susan Collins stated she would vote for Jackson, the first GOP senator to do so. Senators Mitt Romney and Lisa Murkowski also signaled their support, giving the vote somewhat of a bipartisan feel after contentious hearings. Republicans focused on Jackson's experience and record on sentencing, specifically in some child pornography cases during her nomination process. Some continued to make their case leading up to the vote.
Personally speaking, she is bright, she is charming, she is talented, but her record is extreme, and it suggests a 3-decade-long pattern of advocating for very, very lenient sentences for violent criminals, and in particular for sex offenders.
Senate Minority Leader Mitch McConnell said there would be a stark contrast between how his party reacts to the outcome compared to the reaction of Democrats after recent Republican confirmations.
And do you know what won't happen? Top Republicans will not imply she's illegitimate. We will not call for court packing. I won't be joining any mobs outside her new workplace and threatening her by name. Democrats must stop their political siege of the institution that Judge Jackson is about to join.
Democrats beat back the criticism to Jackson's record, characterizing the attacks as distorted versions of the truth. Ultimately, they had the last word.
We are beginning to write another chapter in our nation's quest for equal justice under the law. And that chapter begins with 3 letters. KBJ.
Jackson was watching the vote with President Biden at the White House as it happened. She'll officially take her place on the bench this summer when Justice Stephen Breyer retires. John and Jenna.
All right, Matt Galka for us at the Capitol. Thank you, Matt. And here now to discuss, Julia Manchester, political reporter with The Hill, and CBN News chief political analyst David Brody. Both of you welcome. David, to you first. A historic day for our country, but as Matt just mentioned, Judge Jackson won't become Justice Jackson until later this summer when Justice Breyer officially steps down. That said, what are some of the bigger cases you're keeping an eye on, and what might we expect from Jackson?
Well, before I get to that, can I just take 10 seconds to pause out of political analysis mode and just say, look, historic moment. This is a big seminal moment in American history, and we should just all take a step back and see just how far this country has come. Period, end, full stop. Moving on to the political analysis of the day. Look, a couple things. First of all, Stephen Breyer, as you just pointed out, will be indeed on the court all the way through the term, which ends in June. So she won't start hearing cases until the fall. There's one big case, of course, on affirmative action that she won't even take part in because of her Harvard connections, and she's recused herself already from that case. So that's going to be the big one. But there is another big one on religious liberty, religious freedom. There is a case called 303 Creative LLC versus Ellenis, and Ellenis is in essence, the Christian website designer who does not want to make gay marriage websites for gay couples. And so once again, back to the Colorado baker and all of the gay wedding cake. Well, now we're into websites, and that will be a big decision, or excuse me, a big case that you'll hear in the fall. So that's what I'm looking at. And of course, a lot of the criminal justice stuff, especially based on the fact that she had quite a few sharp-ended questions about that.
To David's point, Julia, a monumental and historic appointment. We're still 7 months out from November, this midterm election year. Julia, could Judge Jackson's appointment, though, give Democrats the boost they badly need?
You know, I think that's what Democrats are hoping for. However, we have to look at the timeline here. We're in April right now, and then she will be appointed and officially ascend to the high court later this summer. Midterms aren't till November. So I think Democrats have to be very careful with how they frame that messaging, because voters' memories are short and they may not be paying attention to Justice Jackson, the person. I think instead what you're going to be hearing from Democrats is the importance of elections and why elections matter, and the fact that we now have a conservative Supreme Court, or leaning Supreme Court, because of elections, presidential elections. But they will, of course, cater this to a midterm election. And you'll also, depending on what happens with the high court ruling on the Mississippi abortion law, for example, at the end of June, you will hear them talking about the importance of what they would like to be a liberal leaning court when it comes to issues like abortion, when they're campaigning for state legislature seats, for example. We know that state legislatures, state houses, state governors will be, on the Republican side, are likely to be rolling back a lot of, I should say, implementing abortion restrictions if the court rules in favor of Mississippi in the summer.
David, what happens if Republicans do take back the Senate and another Supreme Court seat becomes available? Axios reporting Mitch McConnell won't commit to hearings for another Biden pick if it's up to him. Of course, we all remember what happened to Merrick Garland back in 2016.
Well, a couple of things. The Merrick Garland situation was about a year or so, or a little less than a year before the midterm, or before the election. Look, it depends on the timing. I mean, if it's right after the midterm elections and it's about 2 years before the presidential election, then it's going to be very hard for Mitch McConnell, even though he could. I think politically, in a PR standpoint, it'd be very hard for him to really block a Supreme Court nomination. Having said that, let's just quickly, and I'll just do this quickly, but let's just go through the list. I mean, who's going to retire exactly? On the liberal side, right, you've got Elena Kagan and Sonia Sotomayor. They're not going anywhere. KBJ just got there, so that's 3. And then you look at the conservatives, and you got Gorsuch and Kavanaugh and Amy Coney Barrett and John Roberts. None of them are going anywhere. So that leaves Sam Alito, probably not, obviously not. And then Clarence Thomas. So I think we're now at Clarence Thomas potentially being older, and also with some of the health issues that he's had recently. But let's also get back and dial in reality. Why in the world would Clarence Thomas, unless it was something he had to because of health, resign during a Biden administration? So I don't see this coming at all.
All right. Well, unfortunately, we're out of time. Love our conversations with both of you. Thank you so much. Julia Manchester, David Brody, great to have you.
Thank you.
Thank you both. Well, the backlash against Russia growing as mounting evidence of atrocities in Ukraine come to light. At the U.S. Capitol, in a vote of 100-0, the Senate voted to limit trade with Russia and to ban oil imports from the country. And at the United Nations, 93 countries voted to suspend Russia from the UN Human Rights Council, a move praised by the European Union ambassador to the UN.
Suspension is necessary to uphold the integrity of the Human Rights Council, the authority of the General Assembly, and the credibility of the UN human rights system. The rare decision this Assembly has taken today sends a strong signal of accountability and hopefully will help preventing and discouraging more violations of human rights.
The vote marks the first time a permanent member of the Council has had its membership revoked.
Well, as Russia's war rages on in Ukraine, millions continue to search for refuge, often thousands of miles away from their homeland. Here in the United States, hundreds arrive each day after the Biden administration opened the door for up to 100,000 refugees.
CBN's Brody Carter has more on the issues they face and the help awaiting them as they come into the American homeland.
The administration's offer has led to a new surge of immigrants, although many aren't following the rules. At the U.S.-Mexico border, more than 2,000 Ukrainians are seeking asylum as the government sifts through who gets priority to enter and whether they have permission.
Most of them are coming illegally, crossing the border into California, and then just spreading out.
Yes, it's difficult. For us, it's difficult. A little cold at night.
Some of these refugees figured out one of the quickest ways to get into the United States is by booking a flight to Mexico.
In Tijuana here in Mexico, and there's a lot of refugees came, and people are coming. About 300 people every day. 300 more people are coming.
We set up a system of host families who can take in refugees that are coming here.
Sacramento's House of Bread Church is providing food, shelter, and support to people starting over in the States. The city already has the country's highest concentration of Ukrainian immigrants.
The reason people come to places like Sacramento is because there's a high population of people that know them. And because it's relational, there's this feeling of, hey, we gotta help, we gotta do something.
Little is known about the Homeland Security Department's plan to resettle these refugees, including the timeline or formality. Its website points out Ukrainians have 18 months to find a job and must apply online for asylum or temporary residence. Their growing presence at the already crowded southern border could lead to an even bigger crisis if the Biden administration follows through with a heavily debated policy move.
The Department of Homeland Security is saying that with the end of the Title 42 expulsions beginning in May, the federal government is planning for up to 18,000 illegal immigrants crossing per day.
That's more than 500,000 immigrants each month, with Cubans and Haitians arriving in record numbers. Governor Abbott is literally sending a message to the president in the form of a bus filled with illegal immigrants headed to Washington.
We are sending them to the United States Capitol, where the Biden administration will be able to more immediately address the needs of the people that they are allowing to come across our border.
In response to the rising number of refugees, the White House said Wednesday it would provide cell phones to illegal immigrants in order to track and check in with them as they await immigration court.
In addition, I would note the Department of Homeland Security also put together a preparedness plan to continue addressing irregular migration that involves surging personnel and resources to the border, improving border processing, implementing mitigation measures, and working with other countries in the hemisphere to manage migration.
The Homeland Security Department, responsible for border security, has made its budget request for 2023, which includes a $6 billion increase. Part of that includes 600 new positions on the border. If Congress doesn't approve the budget, Texas lawmakers warn of international gangs targeting the southern border. That is, if resources are not added soon. Brody Carter, CBN News.
All right, thank you, Brody. Unemployment, inflation, and all things economy. Next on Faith Nation.
And welcome back. Unemployment claims remain at levels unseen in more than 50 years. According to numbers released today from the Labor Department, jobless claims fell to 166,000 last week, down 5,000 rather from the previous week. U.S. employers also extended a hiring streak, adding at least 400,000 jobs for 11 months straight.
All right, let's bring in Mark Hamrick, Washington Bureau Chief and Senior Economic Analyst at Bankrate. Mark, welcome. Your thoughts on these latest numbers and historically low unemployment?
Well, the job market is probably the best thing the economy has going for it right now. And the fact that we're getting back to levels that were last seen, as you noted, in the late 60s when the Beatles were still together is quite remarkable. And the U.S. population at that point was only 200 million. So we've grown a lot as a country, and yet we're at those levels of jobless claims that occurred when we were smaller in terms of population. So most recently, the nation's unemployment rate went down to 3.6%. That's very close to where we were right before the pandemic began.
Mark, I like the Beatles reference. We can talk about our favorite Beatles songs after the show. But right now, even with low unemployment, Americans face high inflation and fears of recession. Are those fears valid? And what can people do to protect their finances if the economy indeed dips into a recession?
Well, the fears are a product of the fact that there is a historical record that suggests that the central bank, the Federal Reserve, can overshoot when it begins raising interest rates and tighten too much. And the Fed is signaling that it is really ready to slam the brakes on here and raise rates perhaps much more than had previously been expected. And that is in response to historically high inflation. Our most recent survey of economists of Bankrate put the risk of recession at 1 in 3 in the next 12 to 18 months. In terms of bulletproofing your portfolio or your personal finances really more broadly, I would say best practices hold true in good times and bad. That's make saving for emergencies a priority, have a budget, know what you're spending, know what money's coming in, and continue to save for retirement. Really need to know where your money's coming from and where it's going. And if you need to, try to tighten up a bit.
Yesterday, the Fed signaled that it's going to take more aggressive action to fight inflation. Mark, what does that look like?
Well, what it means is that along with the most historically elevated inflation that many of us have experienced in our lifetimes, or let's just put it that way, particularly for younger Americans, because we're talking about comparisons to the 80s and 70s, we're going to see a tightening cycle more than likely on the part of the Federal Reserve, raising those interest rates as aggressively as many Americans have also ever experienced. And so we can hope that somehow this inflation will fix itself, but the war in Ukraine has really made that a much more daunting consideration. And so we've lived through high interest rates before, and I think the Fed has studied that history and knows that it can do a lot to dampen inflation.
All right, Mark Hamrick with Bankrate. Thank you, sir. Have a great evening.
Thank you.
Thanks, Mark. A perfect storm of problems creating a food supply crisis. Up next, why grocery prices are soaring. And welcome back. Inflation, supply shortages, and the war in Europe all point to a looming global catastrophe.
As CBN senior international correspondent Dale Hurd reports, food experts warn a historic famine is on the horizon, with 285 million people at risk of starvation.
It's mealtime in the nation of Yemen, but Ghalib al-Najjar isn't eating so that his children have enough food. He says he and his family live like ants or fish. We eat what we can find. Experts warn that in the months ahead, food is going to be harder to find in many more nations. A perfect storm of several problems is decimating the world food supply. It's being called the biggest food crisis since World War II. An estimated 285 million people face starvation. The head of the World Food Program, former South Carolina Governor David Beasley, says the world food supply already faced a catastrophe before the war in Ukraine.
We're so short of funds already, and now with Ukraine, we've got 50% rations for people, for example, in Yemen. Niger, 50% rations. Chad, 50% rations. And 50% don't have anything, those who are in extreme need.
In the U.S., Americans have seen food costs rise almost 10% over last year, the steepest increase in 40 years. And experts predict it will lead to an increase in malnutrition among America's poor. In the developing world, however, it's become a matter of life and death. Russia and Ukraine together produce almost 1/3 of the world's wheat, but Ukrainian farmers have been sidelined by the war, and Russia has banned exports.
they've got to be planting again and harvesting again. If they don't, then you're going to have a global supply problem.
And the war in Ukraine is only the latest of many problems to hit the world food supply. Food prices were already high from soaring inflation and fuel costs. Fertilizer prices are now 40% higher than a month ago before the invasion of Ukraine, which, along with high fuel prices, makes it too expensive for some farmers to plant crops this year.
We've never seen these type of increases in fertilizer. You're talking 300–400% increases in a 14-month period.
Add to that a drought that damaged this spring's U.S. winter wheat harvest. In China, severe flooding late last year wrecked the wheat harvest and has the communist government trying to buy up as much of the world's supply as possible. And now a growing list of nations have banned agricultural exports to other nations. Reverend Eugene Cho of Bread for the World says the U.S. needs to do more to fight global hunger, asking Congress to approve $3.8 billion in supplemental emergency funding.
But let's just talk about Afghanistan. 98% of the population do not have enough food to eat. 98%, 1 million children under the age of 5 could die from malnutrition by the end of this year.
Even Africa's wealthiest nation faces a food crisis, according to Nigerian agri-investor Imal Silva, who told us a majority of Nigerians face malnutrition.
Those that are most affected are the majority in the lower and middle class, in the society. Those that are living below a particular level of income would feel the pinch, and that's quite a large majority.
And Beasley warns the world's food crisis could spiral into a political crisis.
You got catastrophe coming to catastrophe, so don't be surprised if you don't see destabilization in several nations over the next 6 to 9 months.
Dale Hurd, CBN News.
Coming up, leaving behind the bombs with an appeal for peace. Ukraine and Russia coming together through the art of ballet. Finally tonight, in a time of war, inspiration through the art of dance.
As Russia's invasion of Ukraine continues, world-renowned ballet dancers from the two countries are performing together, taking to the stage in a ballet to promote peace. The Ukrainian and Russian dancers shared the stage in the San Carlo Theater in Naples. The event helped to raise money for the Red Cross and its efforts in war-torn Ukraine. Just beautiful.
Beautiful, and another universal language, just like music, the language of dance.
Indeed.
Thanks for watching.
Have a great night.